Poor kid, Paul thought as he glanced at the scrawny boy in the back seat of his cop car. He felt kind of bad for what he was about to do, truly. But not that bad. Oh, right. He needed a name for the report. You got a name, kid? Wally. Wally West. Weird name for a Mexican kid to have, he thought, nodding slowly. Well, I'm Paul. Nice to meet you, Wally. You got any folks around these parts? Wally seemed to weigh his options for a moment. Smart. No, sir. I never really knew my parents. I think they took care of me when I was really young, but I've been alone as long as I can remember. Typical, though it could be a sob story. Paul shook his head solemnly. Can't imagine it's been easy growing up in Chicago like that, kid. You been getting along fine on your own? Wally shrugged. It's tough, but I'll manage. I've got things to live for. Wally paused for a moment as the cop car rolled past the soup kitchen. Hey, you missed the soup kitchen, he muttered. Paul let out a faux guilty sigh. I know. I'm sorry, kid. Sorry that I'm just doing what's best for you, he thought. Paul turned into the police station, causing Wally to leap from his seat and frantically tug at the doors of the police car. Unfortunately for him, they were locked. We have some video footage of you using a crowbar to break into the back entrance of a Jewel-Osco. Even if I understand your situation, I still have to bring you in. Paul didn't have anything. The police department didn't have anything. Mack had committed one or two minor crimes, dine and dashing, maybe stealing a bag of chips here and there, but he had never done a B&E. Paul assumed that he must have done something, though, because that's the kind of person Paul was. Paul got out of the car and walked around to the back, opening one of the doors. You're just a kid, so I don't want to have to rough you up when I take you in. Can I trust you to walk into the station with me? Wally nodded, appearing to resign himself to custody. Paul stepped back from the door, beckoning for him to step out. Come on, Wally. I'll do my best to get you a light sentence, all right? He lied. Looking at the way the boy walked, Paul could tell that this kid belonged behind bars. It's the natural position of his kind, Paul thought. Hopefully, soon enough, we'll get all of them where they belong. In a world they understand. Prison. Paul would never get the opportunity to sentence Mack Arnoldson. Shortly after this event, his life would fall apart. His children would disown him. He would lose his job after a man he had beaten threatened to sue the police department. And he would be fined for most of his worth after it was found he stole and sold police property to extremist groups in the Chicagoland area. 3 years later, Paul would be found dead in his apartment. At first, the police would rule it a suicide, but after reviewing the security footage, they would see that an armed man wearing a wooden mask had entered the apartment complex 2 minutes before his estimated time of death and exited through a side door covered in blood 3 minutes after his estimated time of death. The killer would never be identified or caught. A silence hung in the air for several seconds. Mack and Sophie remained as still as rocks, mortified expressions plastered across their faces. Grigory Roskin motioned to the ground, silently commanding the two of them to sit down. They couldn't help but comply. How long have you known of this facility? Roskin questioned. Mack and Sophie shared an uneasy look before Sophie opened her mouth to speak. We found it yesterday, she explained. We were just walking around in the woods and... You did not know of it before approximately 1:16 p.m. yesterday? That's a very specific time, Mack commented. one that doesn't mean anything to us. Roskin reached into his pocket and removed a piece of alchemical chalk. In 1995, I created a seal on that building, which trapped everything in it inside, until something else entered. Yesterday, at 1:16 p.m. in your local time, I felt the seal break. So, were you the guy we saw entering the building last night? If so, why did it take you so long to get here? Sophie eyed the shotgun nervously, noting that it was just about the right size to be stowed in a duffel bag. Yes. It took me 7 hours and 45 minutes to travel from eastern Wyoming to here. We are very lucky that I made it before anything got out. Roskin paused for a moment, carefully considering the words he would say next. I am sorry for your other friend. These Strigoi have probably... Other friend? Mack interjected. Roskin's eyebrows rose in equal parts intrigue and worry. I assumed by the blood trail and the lack of a body that there was a third person with you. Is this not the case? It's not, Mack confirmed. What short? Roskin mumbled under his breath. Are either of you injured? Were either of you injured? Sophie pointed at herself wordlessly. And you are no longer injured, he followed up. Sophie nodded. Grigory Roskin let out a long sigh, stood up, turned the safety off of the shotgun, and pointed it squarely at Sophie. Consider it a mercy, Devochka. It took Sophie's brain a few seconds to fully process why she wasn't dead. Mack had slammed into Roskin the moment before he fired, jostling the shotgun enough to cause a near miss. Or as close to a near miss as a shotgun can have, considering the rapidly spreading bloodstain in her side and the loss of feeling in her arm. The two men wrestled on the ground, Mack trying to steal the shotgun and Roskin struggling to maintain his control of it. You do not understand, boy, Roskin forced out between grunts of exertion. You do not understand what you're dealing with. Then explain, Mack retorted. Roskin managed to land a vicious punch to the side of his head, causing him to relent his grip long enough for Roskin to reclaim control of the gun. He turned it over to Mack. Stop! Don't move! Roskin was interrupted as Sophie leapt on him and wrapped her remaining hand around his neck. He attempted to swivel the gun back to her, but she pinned it to the ground under her shoulder before he could. The old man released the weapon and began to desperately claw at the fingers around his throat. Despite Sophie's injuries, she was easily overpowering him. He tried to speak, but his airways were completely constricted. All that came out was a croak. The world around her faded, all of her focus honing in on the man on the ground. She felt the overwhelming urge to squeeze as tight as she could, to crush his windpipe and snap his neck, to carve him open and feast on Sophie! Mack practically screamed in her ear as he struggled to pull her hand off of Roskin. Enough! She snapped out of whatever trance she had been in, releasing his neck. Roskin gasped and sputtered for air, color returning to his face. He muttered something, but it was too quiet for Sophie to hear. What was that, old geezer? Sophie leaned in. Your arm. Roskin managed to whisper before his head rolled back and he was lost to unconsciousness. Sophie glanced at the forearm that had been blown off to see bones forming where the old ones had been. New flesh and muscle tissue crawled up the arm about an inch behind the reforming bone. Her arm was slowly regenerating itself. What the fuck? Sophie wrapped her hand around the base of her temporary stump and stumbled backwards, slamming into the bus. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? Are you okay? Mack rushed over to help, but before even touching her, he could feel the impossible heat radiating off of her skin as her cells worked overtime to regenerate the missing limb. I don't know! Sophie squealed. I don't know what's happening! Mack glanced over to the unconscious form of Grigory Roskin. I bet there's one person who would know. Grigory Roskin awoke, slowly. He was colder than expected, the crisp October air beating against his exposed arms and neck. The high-collar lab coat he was wearing prior to the fight was now being used as makeshift rope to bind his arms together behind the chair. Any thought he might have had of trying to escape was immediately dashed when he saw Mack leaning against a nearby tree, shotgun aimed lazily at his chest. Sophie stood a little further back, hands shaking as she held the revolver he had stuffed back into their pack. "Do not point a gun at something you do not intend to kill," Roskin muttered. "And how do you know we don't intend to kill you?" Mack half questioned, half threatened. He levered the shotgun for emphasis, sending a shell clattering to the ground. "You would have done so while I was unconscious," Roskin monotoned, eyes drifting to the shell now on the forest floor. "Do not lever the shotgun without firing. You have just ejected an unspent shell. It is not intimidating." "Look, just start talking or you will kill me, cocksucker. This is not the first interrogation I have been under. Put the guns down first." Mack slowly lowered the shotgun. Sophie followed suit with the revolver, breathing an audible sigh of relief as she did so. "There, much better, da? Ask your questions." "Who are you?" Sophie prodded. "As I have already said, I am Grigory Roskin." "Still doesn't answer my question." Roskin let out a frustrated sigh. "Fine. I am Grigory Roskin, linguist, historian, and scientist. I am 62 years old, and I emigrated from Russia to America in 1989 to work for Pharos." "Pharos?" Sophie's eyebrows raised in sudden interest. "I have, like, a billion questions to ask you." "Do I need to answer these questions, or are we—" "Yes, you need to answer them." Mack wore a sly grin on his face, relishing the rare moment where he was the one in control of the situation. "Fine," Roskin growled. Okay. Sophie jumped up and down like a kid on Christmas morning. "First, that boat explosion in the harbor like a year ago. What was up with that?" "I don't know," Roskin mumbled. "Some experiment went wrong and the ship blew up. It wasn't a project under my supervision, so I wasn't given any real information." "Why not?" Sophie followed up. "Because I didn't need to know." Roskin's expression grew dour. "Okay, fine, sure. What was up with that weird thing we saw in the building? Why are parts of the blueprint blacked out? Why did the building get shut down?" Sophie hit him with a barrage of questions. "I would presume that what you saw was a strigoi. The blueprint is blacked out because that section of the building is need to know only. And the building was shut down because of a very serious accident that happened inside." "Need to know basis? Why?" Sophie pestered. "What's a strigoi? Why did I start regenerating after it bit me and—" "Slow down!" Roskin commanded. "I can only think so fast with that incessant babbling. Please." Sophie glanced away, struggling to hold back a tear. Roskin was perplexed by this girl. Despite basically holding him at gunpoint, she was genuinely hurt when he yelled at her. "Thank you." Roskin nodded his head appreciatively. "Now, I think I can answer all of these questions with one response. Or, at the very least, get you to stop asking them. I would prefer if you untied me, though. A visual representation is helpful." "Not happening." Mack crossed his arms. "Very well." Roskin mentally prepared himself for what he was about to say. "In 1983, I was a member of the KGB's Psychotronic Research Division, studying potential supernatural phenomena for military applications. I started to notice a statistical anomaly among my peers. Their death rates were higher than other departments, and many of their deaths were abnormal. Over the next 6 years, I compiled data and studied the results." Roskin shuffled in his seat uncomfortably, briefly pausing his monologue. Neither of them noticed that he was gradually untying his hands from behind his back. After finding a new position, he continued. "In 1989, I coined the most important laws in the history of supernatural studies as a result of this investigation, aptly named Roskin's Laws of the Self-Attraction of Anomalous Phenomena. The layman's explanation is this: the supernatural exists, and it is attracted to itself by fate. The more supernatural a thing is, the higher likelihood it will encounter something else that is supernatural. This goes not just for creatures, but objects, phenomena, and crucially, information as well. Knowing about this supernatural makes your supernaturality go up, and this is a very bad thing. Supernaturality? Mack interjected. What does that actually mean? Things that should not or cannot exist, but do anyway. The exact definition is more complicated than that, but I did say I'd be giving you a layman's summary. Anyway, that is not the point. What I mean to say is this. Knowledge is the most powerful thing in our world, but it is also dangerous. The more you know, the more likely you are to encounter something unpleasant. Very few in this industry live past 40. So is Pharaoh some secret government program to hide the supernatural? Is that why they're hiding it? Sophie pitched in. Roskin rolled his eyes. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't be willing to explain any of this. Unfortunately, he still needed more time to untie himself. That's why we are hiding it, yes, he confirmed. If the world at large were to learn the things we know, billions would die as a result over the next 100 years. As for being a government agency, not since 1981. We work alongside them occasionally, but we're independent. Okay, one more question. Sophie's expression darkened. Why did you try to kill me? I expected that to be the first question, Roskin mused. You have been bitten by a creature known as a strigoi. They possess supernatural strength, agility, and regeneration, and their hearing is almost unmatched, but they are mostly blind. They can emit a sine wave that acts like echolocation. Mack shifted the shotgun from one hand to the other. You're stalling. Get on with it. Fine. Their bite is infectious. Within 3 days, you will become one. Without a coffin full of graveyard dirt and a number of human sacrifices, there will be no way to maintain your mental faculties once the transformation is complete. Only a small part of you will remain, and it would be better to die than to live like that. Is there a cure? A vaccine? An antidote? Max sputtered. Sophie remained silent. Of the kind you are thinking, no. This is not just a physical infection, but also one of your mind. It cannot be removed by traditional medicine. However, we did create I suppose you could call it a supernatural cure. There is one batch remaining in the entire world, and it is in that very facility. Speaking of which, Roskin's lab coat fell to the ground, and he removed his hands from behind his back. Hey! Mack raised the shotgun threateningly. Don't move! I must reseal it. He stood nonchalantly and turned back towards the gravel road. Sit down or I'll blow your head off! Mack ordered. No, you won't, Roskin observed. You do not yet have the heart to kill another human being. Good luck with whatever you decide to do next, boy. I will return to this bus tomorrow at approximately 5 p.m. If you are still here, we will speak again at that time. Mack wrapped his finger around the trigger and closed one eye like he'd seen in movies, centering his focus on the middle of Roskin's back. He took a shaky breath in, steadied himself, and he lowered the weapon. He couldn't bring himself to do it. As for the shotgun, Roskin mumbled as he walked away, working his arms back to the sleeves of his mud-soaked lab coat. You can keep it. With where you're going, you'll need it more, and I can always get another. The two of them watched Grigory Roskin march away until he disappeared. Sophie slid her back down the side of the bus, sitting crisscross on the ground. She stared down at her shaking hands, the edges of her vision beginning to grow dark as the panic set in. Push it down, her mind roared. You're happy? You're a happy-go-lucky, normal girl from Chicago. You have to be happy. If you act happy, you are happy. Be happy. Be happy. Be happy. Mack knelt down to her, opening his mouth to speak. Hey, he rasped. It's okay. Sophie slowly raised her head, forcing her mouth to curl into a smile. Yeah, she nodded. Yeah, it's all okay. Everything's going to be all right. She started to stand up, and Mack followed. Sophie, I'm worried about... Nothing to be worried about, Sophie cut him off. I'm okay. Are you sure? You don't seem... Yep, I'm all fine. Sunshine and rainbows. To the murder structure! Sophie pointed into the distance with a long finger. After refastening their packs and delegating that the shotgun should be strapped to Mack's back, the two departed down the path. Mack fiddled with the snub nose as he adjusted the straps of his backpack. He inspected the shiny, freshly polished sidearm with a passive curiosity. How does this thing work exactly? He puzzled. It's not that complicated, dude, Sophie commented. You point it at something, click, and it doesn't exist anymore. That's an interesting way to put it. Is there any specific way to handle it I should be aware of? Hell if I know, Mack. I just swiped the thing. All I know is you gotta conserve your shots, because we only have 5. Alright, that's not ideal. Guess I'll have to make them count. Yep, Sophie chirped. Oh, we're here. The tree line gave way to that same wide clearing they had entered for the first time just yesterday. The building sat imposingly on the other side, breaking the monotony of the far tree line. Alright, Mack glanced over towards Sophie. He said there's a cure in there, but never told us where it is. When we were looking at the maps, we saw chemical storage, right? Yeah, I still have it. Hold on. She pulled the map out of her backpack, unfurling it and holding it at arm's length in front of herself. We came in through entrance A1. It looks like the chemical storage area is pretty close by. And what if the cure isn't labeled? Mack inquired. Or what if it isn't there? Sophie pursed her lips in contemplation, moving the map closer to her face. If that's the case, we can figure something out. It looks like there's a room called Records in the main building. They'd probably have information on it there, right? I mean, that's a good distance from chemical storage. I suppose it's better than nothing, though. Sophie nodded. Well, it's our best shot. You sure you want to go through with this? Dude, I don't think I could live with myself if I didn't. Sophie smiled warmly. Thank you, Mack. As they approached the facility, a creeping feeling of dread began to well up in Sophie's stomach. She pushed it down with a shaky breath, which Mack caught out of the corner of his eye. He glanced over at her, and she smiled meekly. Mack couldn't help but feel that something about her had changed. Has she always been that tall? He thought. No, that can't be right. I was at least a full head above her yesterday, and now we're at eye level. Okay, let's get this done, Sophie tittered, walking up to the half-open door and turning the handle. They were hit with the iron-rich smell of dried blood, no doubt a result of their trespassing yesterday. Sophie crept forward, subconsciously inhaling as she crossed over the threshold of the old building. Mack's fingers wrapped around the snub nose tightly as he stepped in behind her. They were in the room labeled Entrance A1. On the far side of the room was the door Mack had seen yesterday, with that same oddly disquieting radial symbol next to it. It was already open. Sophie crept over to it and leaned her head around the frame. Past the door was a long, dark hallway that branched off to the right about halfway down. More symbols were etched on the walls, patterns of triangles folding in on and overlapping each other to create more complex shapes. After making sure the coast was clear, she waved Mack over. Once she heard Mack fall in line behind her, she inched forward into the hall. It's dark as shit in here, Mack whispered. I can't see a thing. I can see fine, Sophie responded. Everything's just kind of a stale gray. Grab your flashlight. Mack fished into his backpack as quietly as possible, producing his flashlight and turning the beam on. The light cascaded down the dark hall, illuminating a faded poster on the left wall about 20 feet in front of him. The laminated poster bore white text on a striking red background. In case of emergency, remember the APHID protocol. A. Alert security staff. P. Proceed to emergency shelter. H. Hide until rescue teams arrive. I. Inform rescue teams of any injuries. D. Debrief with post-incident teams. Mack pointed the poster out to Sophie, who scanned it and then gave a quick nod. The two continued to creep forward, passing the offshoot hall and arriving at the door on the far end. Sophie looked down at the blueprint in her hands. This should lead into Corridor A. As she slowly pried the door open, the rusty hinges made a spine-chilling whining sound that echoed softly. She winced and waited, listening to see if anything else would arrive to investigate the noise. When nothing came, she progressed into Corridor A. Across the hall was a door labeled Chemical Storage. Perfect. She slinked into the long corridor, glancing in both directions to ensure none of those things were present. Mack followed closely behind her. The door's handle was rusted in place, much to the dismay of the duo. They'd need to use something to bust it open. Luckily, Mack had just such an item. His crowbar, which he pulled from his backpack. He carefully wedged it between the door and its frame before levering it as hard as he could. The sound of creaking metal bounced down the corridor, and Sophie began to hear a low chittering noise off to her right. Shit. Mack pressed his back up against the corridor wall and took in the largest gasp he could. A moment later, the Strigoi flung itself around the corner like a car drifting, the sheer speed of its motion causing it to skid into the wall. It raked its claws across the ground like a cat on wet tile as it bounded forward towards the noise. It came to a jolting halt in front of the now open door, turning its bulbous head towards it. Its ears twitched as they strained to pick up any other sound. Mack became acutely aware of every noise in his vicinity. The subtle drip of some liquid in the distance, the creaking and shifting of the structure's ancient supports, and the gurgle building in the Strigoi's throat as its mouth peeled open into a smile, revealing a row of needle-like, faintly transparent teeth. Sophie was even more aware than he was. She could hear the subtle groaning of the door as it began to swing back closed, the minute tapping of the thing's claws against the concrete floor, and she could hear Mack's heartbeat. It was such a quiet sound that she couldn't pinpoint the exact location, but it gave her a range of only a few feet. And if she could hear it... The Strigoi began to advance towards Mack with bared teeth, moving with such jolty and unsettling motions that it reminded him of stop-motion animation. Sophie slid her left foot forward slowly, unclenching her hand and curling her fingers into a claw-like formation. Mack's eyes drifted in her direction, glazed over with fear. She didn't understand exactly what her plan was, but she'd only have a moment to do something. The Strigoi began to lift itself from the ground, craning its neck to the side as drool rolled down its chin. The ears twitched more as its head approached Mack, jaws growing even wider apart. He saw the wet teeth glistening in his flashlight beam. Sophie heard the thing's leg tense before she saw it. It was about to pounce. She did it first. With a single, impossibly rapid motion, she covered the distance between them. She brought her clawed hand up, swinging it into the thing's forehead on pure instinct. Her fingers pierced through the fur, flesh, and tissue like a carcass saw through an assembly-line pig. They met some resistance at the bone, but the fingers ultimately broke through, digging into the fetid brain of the thing. Her palm rested against the exterior of the skull, unable to pierce it. She redirected the force of her strike towards the ground, swinging her caught hand downwards and smashing the side of the thing's head into the concrete below with a wet crunch. Fragments of bone clattered across the tile as the Strigoi spasmed desperately on the floor. She raised her stuck hand up, pulling the head with it, and bashed it into the ground again. Another crunch resounded, and the thing stopped twitching. Mack's mind was still struggling to comprehend what had just happened by the time Sophie shoved him into the chemical storage room. He was watching the moment in slow motion, parsing the information over and over and over again as Sophie swung the rusted door shut, He grappled with the impossible series of actions he had witnessed, even as the Strigoi outside pounded against the door. "Mack!" Sophie shrieked. "We need to go!" He snapped back to reality. The chemical storage area was a maze of shelves, glass doors, and panel walls dimly lit by 20-year-old bulbs. Most boxes and beakers were labeled meticulously with names Mack failed to understand. Sure, he recognized tubs labeled chlorine or iodine, but he had no idea what akashic superfluid or prima materia was. After all, he was only getting fleeting glances at these objects as he ran past them. The chittering of the Strigoi grew even louder as they coalesced at the door, and Mack frantically looked for something, anything that could help them. They had less than a minute before that door came down. Mack came to a stop in front of an 85-pound gas cylinder labeled Radon. "Sophie, I have an idea," Mack whispered. The door came off its hinges 30 seconds later, a solid chunk of metal slamming into the ground and sending a wave of violent noise through the facility. If any Strigoi in this wing hadn't heard them pry the door open, they definitely heard it fall off its hinges. 5 Strigoi crept into the room with immense caution. Though their mental faculties had rotted over the years from being trapped in the dark, they still maintained their animal instincts. Just outside of the door, they had found another of their kind dead. There was danger here, their malformed brains told them. Tread carefully. Listen. They could hear hearts that weren't their own pumping from somewhere in the room, but they would need more time to pinpoint their exact locations. A loud crash came as a jar of some strange chemical was knocked from a shelf. One of the Strigoi moved to investigate the sound, coming to a stop in front of the jar. It grabbed the shattered glass with a claw, turning it over in its hands as if to remember the sensation of holding something as a human would. Then, Sophie dropped the gas cylinder onto its head, cracking it open like an egg. She was sitting on the top shelf of the adjacent rack, remaining as quiet as she could while 2 other Strigoi rushed over to the body. Despite her best attempts, one of them glanced up to meet her gaze. It stood from the ground and reached an elongated arm up to her, slowly and gently, like how one might approach an aggressive stray kitten. It was taller than the rest, and the others seemed to look at it with a sort of reverence. A shotgun round tore into its side, sending the creature to the ground. The moment it was down, the other Strigoi leapt towards Mack with horrific speed. He didn't even have enough time to lever the shotgun before the thing was on him. At least, it would have been on him if Sophie hadn't jumped down and grabbed its ankle at the last second. It spun around to retaliate, but she lifted it off the ground with relative ease and swung it into the nearby shelf like a sack of meat. The shelf's metal supports buckled and it fell backwards, striking another shelf and knocking all manner of strange chemicals onto the floor. Sophie was tackled to the ground from behind as the 4th Strigoi entered the fray. It pinned her arms in place while the 5th Strigoi crawled over to the other side, grabbed her mouth, and pried it open. It unhinged its own jaw in response, and a viscous black ooze began to emerge. It craned forward, and Sophie realized with horror that it intended to vomit the substance down her throat like a baby bird. Thankfully, a shotgun shell to the back of the head at almost point blank was enough to convert its brain case into mist. The 5th Strigoi was also struck by quite a few shells that had traveled through its friend, causing it to jolt and screech in pain. Sophie used the opportunity to wrench one of her arms free. She grabbed a shard of glass from the ground in front of her and drove it into the thing's eye, finally causing it to release her and retreat for a moment. The tall Strigoi Mack had shot earlier stirred, spent shotgun pellets being forced out of its torso by the regeneration process. Mack had ruptured practically every vital organ in the body, and it was still alive. Roskin said they had regenerative abilities, but this was beyond ridiculous. The Strigoi Sophie had bashed into the shelf, and the one she'd stabbed in the eye were also starting to get back up. The only way to kill these things is to destroy their brains, Mack realized. The only way I can guarantee that is with a shotgun blast, but I only have 1 shot left. Unless... "Sophie, throw me your hairspray!" Mack yelled as he dug through his own backpack. Not taking a moment to question why, Sophie fished it out and tossed it to him. Her head was pounding with adrenaline, muscles aching as the infection warped and twisted the tissue into forms more powerful than the lining could hold. "Sophie, duck!" Mack warned as he shook the can of hairspray. She did him one better, stumbling to the left and out of the line of fire. Though the eyes of the Strigoi were worse than humans, they were still able to make out a sputtering flame in a dimly lit room.
The room was filled with the sound of aerosol igniting as Mack pressed down on the lid of the hairspray can, which was able to act as a makeshift flamethrower in combination with his old lighter. As the Strigoi fur lit, they let out horrid screeches that reminded Mack of rats caught in a trap. They spasmed on the ground wildly, legs twitching in the air like dying spiders. He watched as their cells tried to regenerate, but were overwhelmed by the fire. It was just as Mack had thought. When Sophie was regenerating outside of the facility last night, her body had become so warm it was painful to touch. When these things regenerated, they expended a lot of energy from somewhere to do so, which generated an immense amount of heat. Combining that heat with an external source like fire would mean they burned faster than they could repair themselves, effectively turning their own body heat against them and neutralizing their ability to regenerate. His eyes were drawn to motion in the doorway as two more Strigoi leapt inside. The bonfire that had once been their kin was almost blinding to them, but they were spurred on by the fact that someone was in here somewhere. They recognized the sound of gunfire, and they knew it was nothing good. It was a sound made by the enemy, an enemy they must convert. Sophie grabbed a few empty vials from a nearby shelf and tossed them into the fire, creating more shattering noises in the hopes it would attract the two newcomers. It worked, but only partially. They paused at the edge of the fire, tilting their heads curiously as instinct told them to go no further. That was just fine with her. She reached into the first aid kit inside her backpack and removed a bottle of rubbing alcohol. She unscrewed the cap and underhand tossed it into the flames, causing the bottle to explode in a violent fireball that consumed the newcomers and nearly blinded Mack. After a couple more seconds of wretched screaming, the room fell silent at last, aside from the crackling of the slowly weakening fire. "Holy shit," Sophie muttered, breathing heavily. They had just barely made it through, practically by luck. If the door hadn't given them a moment to plan, they both would have died there for sure. She mentally thanked whatever entity might be responsible for that door being so sturdy. Mack leaned against a nearby shelf, his body slowly working itself down from the most intense minute it had ever experienced. As he turned his head to the side, he saw a laminated notice hanging below an empty section of the shelf. An-sub-107, Strigification Cure, has been moved to records due to concerns of theft. He gestured towards the paper and Sophie nodded in understanding. She leaned her head to one side, then the other, trying to listen for any other Strigoi in this wing. She didn't hear any. This part of the building had the lowest concentration of Strigoi. The handful of them remaining in Wing A had heard the gunshots and the screams of their kin and decided, wisely, not to get involved. "It's safe to speak now." "Before we head out," Sophie whispered, digging into her backpack and removing a fresh change of clothes, "we need to soundproof ourselves." "What? How would we do that?" Mack tilted his head to the side inquisitively. "Soften the footfalls." Sophie wrapped a t-shirt around her shoe and then secured it with masking tape. "Like this." After a few minutes, the two of them had successfully wrapped their shoes in shirts. They tested it out to find that it did, in fact, moderately soften their footfalls. "It helps, but I'm not sure it'll be enough," Mack commented. "Do you know how to breathe quietly?" "What? No," Sophie responded. "All right, put a hand on your stomach." She did so. "When you breathe in or out, your stomach should move, not your shoulders. Now, open your mouth and curl it into an O shape. Inhale through your nose, hold for 3 to 4 seconds, exhale through your mouth." Sophie's attempts weren't quite as subtle as Mack's, but it was an improvement. The two of them took one last look at the blueprint and stepped out into Corridor A. Corridor A contained few amenities. A rusted bench, a long-dead decorative plant, and a water cooler with its own murky brown microbiome inside. The laminated posters on the walls were mostly too faded to read, but Sophie caught details. An office pizza party, some informational charts she didn't understand, and 2 more aphid posters. Mack moved ahead, lowering his center of mass and contacting the ground with the outside of his foot first to further soften his footsteps. He'd read about this technique, the fox walk, in a book about hunting a few months ago, the same place he learned how to breathe more quietly. He passed the door to Office A1 on his right and made to continue, but Sophie tapped the wall to get his attention. He glanced over to see her motioning down a side hall across from Office A1. The side hallway wasn't significant enough to be labeled. It branched off to the left about 60 feet down, an avenue that Mack was not eager to go down. At the end of the hall was a door that looked like it led to a janitor's closet with the word equipment written across the front. Mack grabbed the handle of the door and lifted it up while slowly turning it, a trick he'd learned from his days on the city streets. The door opened with little fuss or noise. Inside of the equipment room was all manner of laboratory, janitorial, and maintenance equipment. It did, in fact, seem to be a glorified janitor's closet. Mack closed and secured the door before the two of them looted the room for anything that might have seemed useful. Mack left the room with a makeshift spear, some shards of glass taped to the end of a broom, and a few MacGyvered noisemakers. Sophie emerged with a sledgehammer and several drill bits stuffed into her pockets. She planned to put them in between her fingers before throwing a punch, presuming that something designed to pierce wood would most likely be better at piercing bone than her fingers. Now, more thoroughly prepared, they returned to Corridor A and made their way down the hall cautiously. Mack stopped for a moment as they passed the armory. The door was wide open. He leaned his head in to see dozens of military-grade firearms displayed in glass racks. He carefully crept his way inside, coming to a stop in front of one of the racks. A faded warning engraved into the glass read, "Alarms will sound if glass is broken." This place has been abandoned for 20 years, he thought, so there shouldn't be any power, right? As he reached towards the glass, he recalled the dimly lit bulbs and chemical storage. Not worth the risk, he concluded. At the end of Corridor A was a cafeteria, the double doors slightly ajar. As Mack approached, he made out a humanoid figure sitting in the corner of the hallway. After nearly jumping out of his skin, he looked more closely to see that the figure was dead, and likely had been for some time. All that remained of them was a skeleton, in what seemed to Mack like some kind of riot gear. The inward crumpled chest armor that had shattered his ribs left little mystery about how this man had died. He wore a gray helmet with a dirty, tinted visor that initially obscured his skull. Several patches that looked like military honors were sewn onto his left shoulder pad, the largest of which was a white square patch with a 5-pointed black star in the center. The scene within the cafeteria was far more grim. 3 folding tables had been overturned and placed in a semicircle as if to make cover for anyone coming through the doorway. A skeleton, similarly dressed to the other though visibly less decorated, lay limply over one of the tables. A few feet beyond him were 3 more bodies, once again dressed in riot garb. 20-year-old bullet casings littered the ground all throughout the room, pieces of shattered firearms scattered across the floor alongside them. The object that demanded the most attention was a massive corpse in the center of the room, resting upon 3 crushed tables. The skeletal structure appeared similar in size and dimensions to a rhino, with 4 squat legs and a bulbous head. The legs in the front, however, appeared to end in several elongated stubs of bone, which reminded Sophie of little fingers. The skull was much larger in proportion to the rest of the body, and it seemed vaguely humanoid. This corpse was obviously far too large to have fit through any of the doorways they had seen so far, which left the question, how had it gotten here? In an attempt to answer this, Mack crept around to the other side to notice that it had left behind a trail of slime-like necrotic sludge, allowing Mack to trace its straight-line movement through the cafeteria. He could see the points where it had thrown tables aside to continue forward. Weirdly, though, the line seemed to stop abruptly, about 5 feet from a door on the other side of the room, the words "Security Checkpoint" painted above it in yellow. He waited for Sophie to catch up before continuing into the checkpoint. The security checkpoint contained, from what Sophie could count, 15 skeletons dressed just as they had seen in the cafeteria. Mack, still following the sludge trail, noticed a gap of about 10 feet between the door and the trail that continued through the room on the other side. It was as though this thing had teleported to the other side of the door, rather than trying to squeeze through. Compared to the A-Wing, the main building was much more unpleasant and much less quiet. Mack and Sophie could hear the distant chittering of strigoi from seemingly all directions, informing them that nowhere would be safe. The hallways were lined with 20-year-old bodies, some adorned in security uniforms, but most in decrepit lab coats and one in a blue janitorial outfit. Sophie tried to ignore it as she kept moving, but Mack noted the continuing slime trail, and that it turned from Corridor D to the north and into Corridor E.
Or, more accurately, this thing had come from Corridor E and turned west to head down Corridor D. In the way of the door to the second armory was the skeleton of a winged creature larger than an elephant. The corpse was so immense that it took up half of the hallway, and its wingspan would have been at least 100 feet. The walls around it were scorched black in patterns like reaching trees. Sophie recognized these as Lichtenberg figures, the marks left behind by lightning strikes. The door to the gym was blockaded by a vending machine, a foldable table, and some heavy-looking crates. Good thing, too, as they could both hear the chirping of dozens of strigoi from inside. Sophie glanced to their right to see the conference hall, a massive and once well-decorated space with a table that could sit at least 60 people. At the back of the room was a chalkboard, the massive writing still barely distinguishable. BOD approval for Project Pinhole Phase 2, 8/16/1995. Yay, 6. Nay, 2. Founder's seat abstains. A strigoi sat 5 chairs from the entrance, staring down at the table silently. A pair of spectacles was haphazardly placed across its face, and a torn lab coat loosely hung from its shoulders. She shuddered at the sight before turning to move into Corridor E with Mack. Corridor E was much the same as Corridor D. Bodies strewn about, a trail of sludge continuing down the hall and into Wing C, and a few unreadable posters on the walls. The entrance to Corridor F was, at one point, locked with what appeared to be a card reader. A gnarled mess of wires and circuits had been shoved onto the reader. Some sort of hacking device. The door was stuck open. Corridor F contained several things that weren't on the blueprint. Mainly a series of small offices to the south, each adorned with a plaque. Mack browsed the names on these plaques for ones he might somehow recognize. Elliot Strasser Sr., Facility Head. Stephen H.P. Rutherford, Chemical Department Head. Grigory Roskin, Biocommunications Department Head. Mack stopped in his tracks, taking a moment to process the name of the man who he'd nearly killed just earlier today. Department Head. That sounds pretty important, he thought. The door leading to records was a behemoth. 15 feet tall, 20 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. The door was locked with an incredibly complex mechanism which would have been the pinnacle of security when it was constructed sometime in the early 1990s. Despite this security, however, the door was wide open. It didn't take long for Sophie to notice why. Lying against the inside of the door was a body, though it appeared significantly fresher than the rest. The body was adorned in a plain, handmade brown cloak, left sleeve rolled up and hood pulled down to reveal the pallid, gaunt face of a young man who could have been no older than 20. A thin cut had been made vertically down the man's left arm, starting at the wrist and ending at the elbow. His left hand was covered in his own dried sanguine fluid, limp and motionless against the cold, uncaring metal of the massive door. A flint dagger rested on the floor nearby. On the ground in front of the man were words, sloppily written in blood.
Praise the apostle of the deceiver, may all hear his name. Praise the three-fingered hand, for our holy mission shall come to pass. The time of resonance is upon us.
Sophie glanced at the man's face again to notice his blue lips were curled into a satisfied smile. It made her shiver. The two of them stopped dead in their tracks as the sound came from the other end of the hall behind them. They turned back to observe, standing in the doorway leading into Corridor F, the same strigoi Sophie had seen in the conference room. In its gnarled left hand was a pen, almost comically small against a massive palm and long fingers. It clicked the pen again. Then it began to meander down the hall towards them. In through the nose, out through the mouth, Sophie reminded herself. She regulated her breathing the best she could, but it kept stumbling closer. It swayed from side to side as it moved, as if it was in a daze or a trance. It came to a stop in front of one of the office room doors and reached out to open it. It rattled the handle, but the door didn't budge. It rattled the handle again, 2 more times. 3, 5. Finally, after nearly a minute of standing there and rattling the door, its persistence seemed to win the day. The door slowly opened, and it meandered into the office. Mack let out an audible sigh of relief. Big mistake. It wheeled around the corner, arching its back and baring its needle-like teeth. It dropped to the ground and began to scuttle over to them. It was clear by the way it was moving that it had already pinpointed Mack's location, and it was approaching fast. Mack grabbed the shotgun from his back and aimed it towards the thing. As he pulled down on the trigger, the Strigoi diverted its course to turn a sure hit into a grazing blow. Some small, human part of its brain still recognized how a gun worked. He levered the shotgun and swiveled to strike at it again, but when he pulled the trigger, he heard a disappointing click. They were out of shotgun shells. Sophie lunged for the Strigoi in a gambit to save Mack, but it intercepted her with a claw swipe which sent her tumbling to the ground. She tried to move her legs, but they wouldn't respond to her commands. She angled her head down to see the reason why. Her midsection had been torn open, muscles shredded like papier-mâché, and intestines spilling out of her abdomen like writhing worms. Her distraction had given Mack enough time to draw the snub-nosed revolver and pull the hammer back. He aimed towards the creature as it slithered closer and fired. It jerked to the side on instinct with a sudden twitchy motion, turning what would have been a headshot into an ineffective hit to the shoulder. It lurched forward ravenously as he fumbled with the snub-nose. He managed to pull the hammer back and wrap his finger around the trigger, but he wasn't fast enough. The Strigoi severed his forearm with a claw. As his arm hit the ground, the hand twitched suddenly, causing the gun to fire meaninglessly into the darkness. Mack let out a blood-curdling scream as the pain of his arm being removed reached his brain. The Strigoi moved forwards again, intent on beheading the man, but Sophie tackled it into the far wall, sending a spiderweb of cracks blossoming out from the concrete, accompanied by the sound of the Strigoi's spine being crushed. Sophie balled her hand into a fist and sent it straight into the Strigoi's skull, ending the thing's life with a satisfying crunch. The beast curled up like a spider, and in that moment her mind picked a peculiar detail to focus on. Its name tag, Elliot Strasser Sr. No time to think. Her refined senses picked up more sets of claws approaching, no doubt from the gunfire. She frantically clambered over to Mack's now unconscious form, intestines sliding across the ground behind her, and picked him up. She dashed into records with his body. While the door to records was difficult to open from the outside, the inverse was far from true. Sophie grabbed onto a massive handle on the inside of the door and, with the strength of 20 men, heaved it closed just as she heard the other Strigoi reach it. She stumbled forward, tossing Mack's body onto a metal table before face-planting into the concrete floor. Mack was bleeding out quickly. Through tears, Sophie fastened the tourniquet around his arm as tightly as she could. The stump was haphazardly wrapped with crimson-tainted gauze. Thank God she'd stolen that first aid kit. "Please, please, please," Sophie prayed. "Please don't die on me." She desperately checked his pulse. Low, she thought, but alive. Thank God. Her thoughts were shattered into a million pieces as her body was racked with fresh pain that trumped even the burning sensation of her still-healing abdomen. The bones of her fingers had been subtly getting longer and thinner all day, but they had finally reached their breaking point. Literally. They snapped, and the fragments gouged her flesh and tissue. Her fingers mangled themselves beyond belief before beginning to mend back into place. The transformation was getting worse. She took a moment to assess the state of its progression. At this point, she was 4 inches taller than Mack. Her eyes were far more sensitive to light. She'd lost almost all of her sense of smell, and her sense of hearing had become unbelievably precise. Her muscles ached constantly, a result of the supernatural strength they had been imbued with, gradually overcoming the limitations of the physical medium. Her head pounded incessantly as electroreceptors began to form and overlap with the tissue in her brain. This would inevitably result in a massive loss in intelligence, but she wouldn't be herself by that point anyway. All in all, she was in the closest thing she could imagine to hell, and she knew it was only going to get worse. Mack was going to be unconscious for at least several minutes. In that time, she decided she would try and find the cure. Her eyes darted around the massive chamber, trying to locate anything of interest. They scraped across the nameplates of several filing cabinets. Amarok, Black Shuck, Copsid Man, Debunked, Crawling Cold, Hide Behind, Siren, Atlantic, Siren, Pacific, Thunderbird, Strigoi. She darted over to the cabinet labeled Strigoi and pulled it open, finding a row of envelopes inside. She began to read the envelope labels. Biology, Containment Protocols, Experimentation, 1991 to 1992. Experimentation, 1993 to 1994. Infection, Unique Substance Extraction, and Sub 52A. Vaccine/Cure, and Sub 107. She grabbed the last folder, tearing it open feverishly and scanning each page inside. She flipped through at least 30 methodical, highly scientific pages discussing the exact chemical makeup of Sub 107, how it was discovered, the multi-step process required to make it, and warnings about improper application, before finally coming upon a page titled Administering the Cure. She began to skim frantically. Should not be administered to employees of clearance level 1 or lower, expendable in this case, induce a coma lasting several hours, body will maintain a semblance of superhuman muscular strength and growth potential post-administration, enhanced sense of intuition, disconnecting from the hive mind proves difficult once already attached, may cause encounters with classified, termination recommended in this case, point of no return. She didn't care about any of this right now. She flipped to the next page and it continued. Administered via the neck. Corroded artery must be pierced. Dramatic and permanent strike in arc levels, about 12,000. Currently located in anomalous substance bin C10 in records, 6/14/1995. That was all she needed to know. Her eyes moved over to one of 5 doors on the other side of the room labeled Substance Storage. Perfect. Substance storage was a massive chamber with rusted metal shelves that climbed all the way to the 50-foot-high ceiling and continued forward past the point where shadows devoured the flashlight's beam. C10, she muttered, scanning the dust-covered bins that stocked the shelves. After a few minutes of searching, she found C10. The syringes inside were surprisingly well preserved. A colorless, shimmering clear liquid sloshed around inside as she grabbed the bin. She counted 6. More than enough, she hoped. She returned to the main room a few minutes later and immediately noticed something was wrong. It was too quiet. Some ambient noise she'd been unaware of this whole time had stopped completely. She didn't realize what it was until Mack's heart beat again. One singular beat, followed by 3 seconds of silence. Then another weak beat, followed by 3 more seconds of silence. He was dying. She could hear the fingers of Death's hand plucking at his vocal cords with each imperceptibly shallow breath he took in. Each feeble beat of his heart was the tick of a clock rapidly winding down to 0. Fuck, no, please, no, 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 no. She begged, rushing over to his side. His skin was a sickly bone pale, chest rising and falling with the speed and urgency of a tectonic plate. There was only one thing she could do, and she desperately did not want to do it. She racked her brain for any other option, any possible alternative to committing such a sin. She had no choice. He was going to die. Her lips peeled back, revealing the elongated canine teeth that dripped with infected saliva. She slowly lowered her head towards his neck and plunged her teeth
into his corroded artery.